Athens, Georgia in 1987 looked a lot like it does today. The University of Georgia brought people in eagerly, and the extraordinary creative, intellectual, and social scenes are what made people never want to leave. But that summer, a string of brutal murders shattered the peace, leaving the classic city forever changed. Athens earned its nickname in 1906, a nod to the namesake in Greece. Governor John Millage envisioned a city that mirrored the ideals of the ancient counterpart, a place where art, theater, and philosophy would thrive. And thrive it did. Athens became a musical powerhouse, giving birth to bands like the B-52s, REM, Pylon, and Widespread Panic. It was and still is the kind of town young adults dream of moving to, a place to learn, to grow, and to belong. The city was safe, fun, and full of life. Reports say that most of the time, people chose not to lock their homes. What could go wrong in their sleepy college town? The sense of community, coupled with the long history, was undeniably creating an irreplaceable quality of life. But 5 Athenians would not be so lucky to live out their lives in harmony. Their lives were taken from them forcefully, brutally, and unthinkably. The reclusive Sutton couple thought they were helping a kid earn some cash by mowing the lawn. Ann Orr Morris wouldn't even be able to make it into her sister's residence after discovering her sister and niece had been hacked to pieces. This is the story of Athens turned upside down, and a young man, or men, who thought they had the right to rob Athens of valuable lives, sisters, mothers, daughters, and friends. They can't be brought back, but we can tell their stories, along with the story of their murderer, because not everything is as red and black as it seems. To uncover the darkest secrets of Athens, Georgia, we have to go behind the headlines. On the corner of Sunset Drive and Oglethorpe Avenue rested 649 Oglethorpe Avenue. The yellow brick Georgian architecture home stood confidently, the home of the well-respected Athens couple, Drs. Glenn and Rachel Sutton. The neighborhood they resided in was safe and quiet, housing mostly retirees and families. The Suttons were both retired but had extremely successful careers. Their neighbor said they were quite reclusive though. They were quiet and kept to themselves, and didn't leave the house very often. Their neighbor stated that even after living behind them for 16 years, he had never met them. They had income from retirement and other investments, and their son was living in Nevada, so they likely lived a quiet life, enjoying not having to worry about much. The house was beautiful and massive, a perfect retirement paradise. It was a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom, 3,000 square foot estate. The Suttons also owned a nearby field that Dr. Glenn Sutton had bought for Rachel to look out over. Unfortunately, the site isn't anything close to the beautiful family home it was in the 80s. The field has since been built upon, and the yellow brick estate garnered the haunting nickname Murder House. As previously mentioned, Glenn and Rachel were both successful individually and as a couple. Glenn was born in late July of 1904 in Indiana. He was the oldest of 2, and in 1922, when Glenn was only 18, he became an accountant for a wholesale grocery store and an elevator company. While working these jobs, he also aided Indiana University as a research assistant while he attended school until 1927. He acquired both his bachelor's degree and master's degree in economics in Indy, and then relocated to Ohio to pursue his doctorate. On December 30th, 1930, Glenn and Rachel tied the knot. In 1942, Glenn then joined the Naval Reserve and served in ranks from lieutenant to captain in the short 3 years he served. Soon thereafter, Rachel and Glenn then put down roots in Athens, Georgia. Glenn had been offered a job at the University of Georgia as a professor and the chairman of the finance department. He also served as the research director for the Savannah location. However, Glenn wasn't done collecting accolades. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, the president of the United States at the time, appointed Glenn to the then active Tariff Commission as vice chairman. He stayed in this position for quite some time until 1969. President Nixon appointed him to the head of the Tariff Commission panel. 2 years later, in 1971, Glenn retired from the commission to continue teaching at UGA and to be a foreign trade consultant. But the impressive cherry on top, Glenn was also the owner of the Georgia Business Review. Rachel, just as acclaimed as her husband, was a professor at the University of Georgia and specialized in elementary education for nearly 40 years. She was the first female to ever be published by the university. The couple was truly a pair of distinguished academics who took a lot of pride in what they did. Unfortunately, their relaxing retirement would be cut short. In April of 1987, the couple would be found stabbed to death in their family home. On April 25, 1987, Glenn and Rachel Sutton's son, William Sutton, had been trying to reach them via phone for a couple of days and was uncharacteristically unsuccessful. William, who went by Billy, lived in Nevada at the time and called his parents regularly, so it was particularly alarming when multiple days passed and he couldn't get a hold of them. Hours passed and Billy didn't receive a return call from his parents, so he called the Athens Police Department and requested that officers conduct a wellness check on his parents, who at the time were in their early 80s. The Athens Police Department made their way over to 649 Oglethorpe Avenue, and from the beginning, something wasn't quite right with the Sutton home. When officers approached the home, they noticed how dark it was, no lights on. Most of the curtains had been drawn, and all of the windows were closed and locked. Officers knocked at the door, awaiting Mr. or Mrs. Sutton to answer, but they never did. They walked around the house a few times, and one of the officers noticed a window had been broken that looked into their garage. The garage was separate from the home, so no one would have been able to get in that way, but the neighbor testified that the window had not been broken the previous night. They also noticed both of the Suttons' cars were at the residence, suggesting that they should both be home. They also noticed that it looked like multiple trees had been struck by a car, and one of the cars had multiple dents on the bumper. The driveway was very narrow and crowded with trees, making it difficult to drive up and down. It seemed as if someone had tried to back the car out of the driveway but was ultimately unsuccessful and hit multiple trees. They also noticed dents in the garage door, as if someone had repeatedly backed the car that was in the garage into the door in order to get out, but the person driving couldn't figure out how to open the door. These observations definitely made the responding officers suspicious, so they called Billy and informed him of what they'd seen so far, and told him there was no way to get into the home. So Billy gave them permission to forcibly enter his childhood home to check on his parents. The officers used a ladder to break into one of the second-story windows. They chose the second story to prevent burglaries until it could be repaired, and once the glass was broken, their noses were assaulted by the unmistakable stench of death. Once inside, they searched the second floor and found nothing. Then they went downstairs and the stench grew stronger. Downstairs is where the bodies of Glenn and Rachel Sutton would be discovered, but some of the accounts conflict with each other about where the bodies were found. Some say both Suttons were located in the butler's pantry, which is the most recorded location. However, one officer remembers that Dr. Glenn Sutton was found on the floor of the dining room, covered in blood with his throat slit. In this particular account, after seeing the gruesomely mutilated body of Glenn, officers immediately called in the scene and then continued to search the home for Rachel. They left the dining room and went to the kitchen, and then proceeded into the butler's pantry, where Rachel's body was ultimately found. Whether or not both bodies were actually located in the butler's pantry is a little bit fuzzy, but no matter what, this scene was horrendous. Rachel's body had been placed in a garment bag that was covered in blood. Next to her was a large piece of furniture that had quite a bit of space underneath it. In that space was a bloodied, rolled up rug that had another body in it, presumably Glenn. The elderly couple had been stabbed to death, but not with a knife. The Suttons had been brutally attacked by an African spear that they owned. Glenn was stabbed in the neck, and Rachel was stabbed from behind in her back. Due to the fact that Billy had not been able to contact his parents, the smell, and simply from the looks of the scene, law enforcement determined that Glenn and Rachel had been deceased for about 3 days. The thing that really perplexed investigators, though, was that there were no signs of forced entry. Another odd thing was that someone had very clearly attempted to clean the bloody scene up. The responding officers noted how the floors were absolutely filthy. It seemed as though someone had tried to mop up the blood, but instead left a messier, stickier floor that made police wonder what the perpetrators' intentions were and how they had failed at mopping so miserably. The Suttons' mop was also missing, likely the murderer trying to cover their tracks. but he actually left behind a lot of evidence. The murderer had actually even stuffed a bunch of blood-soaked rugs into the trunk of the Suttons' car. The only problem with all this evidence, it's 1987. The technology law enforcement uses today is exceptionally more advanced than anything readily available to the authorities in the 80s. All they could really do was lift fingerprints. So that's what they did. However, the prints didn't match anyone in their database, so the police were left with a bunch of fingerprints, 2 dead bodies, and no answers. The first thing that led to a real lead was a witness. A young student who attended UGA and lived on the same street as the Suttons recalled seeing a man putting something into the trunk of their car. The girl then went on to describe him and said he looked to be either a light-skinned African American or someone of Hispanic descent, but she told the police that she thought he looked more Hispanic than African American. She also described him in full to a sketch artist, so now the police had at least something to go off and decided to look into who was documented to be at the house in the recent weeks. Their landscaper was interviewed and ruled out, along with their son, who had the airtight alibi of being across the country, but then they noticed that the Suttons had recently had a paint job done on the home. Law enforcement reached out to the paint company and asked the owner if anyone matching the description had worked there, and surprisingly, there was. So police decided to keep an eye on this man, and they essentially just followed him around for a few days without his knowledge. He didn't do anything suspicious, so police were fed up with following him and just decided to ask outright if he had done it. They walked up to his front door and knocked. A Hispanic man answered and invited them inside, determined to clear his name. He willingly told police about the job he had worked at on the Sutton home and gave them a fingerprint sample. He was ultimately cleared because the fingerprint wasn't even close to the ones lifted from the scene. He must have been flooded with pure relief when he was cleared. Because police were now at a bit of a standstill in finding other leads, they then looked to the city of Athens for help. To keep citizens of the classic city from panicking, police were extremely tight-lipped about this investigation. People were terrified that something so horrible could happen in their little town, but they needed to catch the guy to prevent it from happening again. As you'll soon learn, it did happen again. Nevertheless, the police released the sketch of the man to the public and received countless tips from those in the community who claimed they knew someone who matched the description. However, some speculate that people were fibbing because the reward for finding the man was $20,000. For perspective, $20,000 in 1987 is equal to about $57,000 today. Ultimately, all those tips still led to zilch. As months passed, the city of Athens was still under duress, knowing the criminal was out there. William Sutton, the son of Glenn and Rachel, had a different take on the situation though. He stated, "I don't identify this as a situation unique to Athens. It was home to me for many years, and I know that this sort of thing can happen anywhere." This is a very mature and logical outlook on the nightmare situation, but even so, it doesn't normalize the murder or make the loss of his parents hurt any less. More months went by, and the case was starting to grow colder and colder, and Athens was on edge more than ever. It got to the point where one woman even went to the police station and offered to take responsibility for the murders if it would help her hometown feel safe once again. While this is commendable, it's not a solution, and in August that same summer, our killer would strike again, and it would be far messier. Miss Ann Orr Morris was completely beloved in the Athens community. She came from a prominent family that had been in the area since before it was founded. She was born and raised in Athens and was a creative at heart. An interesting tidbit is that she was the cousin of Flannery O'Connor, the highly acclaimed classic Southern Gothic author. Anne lived on a plot of land on Carr's Hill in Athens, and her family had been there for longer than most people can fathom. Their family home was built in 1790, but unfortunately, part of it burned down in a fire in 1898. The house was later reconstructed and is where Anne and her sister Sally grew up together. The property that their family owned was said to be a 28-acre paradise. It was essentially the equivalent of what is today known as a family compound, where everyone lives on their land in their respective home. From 1942 to 1946, Anne attended the University of Georgia to get her Bachelor's of Fine Arts. She had always been a crafter, but took a special interest in metalwork. She soon, after graduating, left Athens and relocated to the Big Apple to study the craft of silver. She also worked for a bit in Oslo, Norway, in an enameling factory. While she was there, she was the only American, but she soon grew homesick. In 1953, she returned to her childhood home on Carr's Hill and opened a silver, gold, and enameling shop in an old wagon shed just down the street from her home. She was quite the esteemed crafter, specializing in jewelry but not limited to it. She crafted the Stegman football trophy and also created a bowl that was presented to the King and Queen of Greece in 1963, and finally settled down and married Kenneth Morris. The couple lived happily in the home that Ann grew up in on Carr's Hill, and to this day, the home and land are still in the family and occupied by the family members. 2 years after tying the knot, when Ann was 40 years old, she gave birth to twins, expanding her family, and she was also awarded the 1972 Classic Cities Woman of the Arts. A metalsmithing studio at the University of Georgia still stands in Ann's honor because, I'm sure you can infer, she wouldn't make it past the summer of '87. Next door to Ann is where her sister Sally Nathanson, Sally's husband, and their adoptive daughter Helen Nathanson lived. Sally and Ann were closer than most sisters. You could say they were trauma bonded. In their past, Ann and Sally both battled cancer together and survived. However, the cancer left Sally with a voice box in her larynx, and she had basically been taking American Sign Language classes because voice boxes were not nearly as advanced as they are today. So most people struggled to understand her when she spoke. The sisters also had an affliction for exotic plants, likely inherited from their dad, who was a highly esteemed and creative landscape designer. The group of sisters grew the plants together between their two homes on their family's property. Sally also took the creative route and was a needle crafter, specializing in things like needlepoint work and embroidery. Sally had only been back in Athens for a year before tragedy struck. She spent many years in Honolulu, Hawaii, and also in Germany, working as the athletic director for the Red Cross Association. She was so greatly loved and was described as beyond sweet to anyone she encountered. Sally's adoptive daughter, Helen, was only 22 years old and was spending her time attending UGA as a psychology major. And she also worked at the local drug emporium. Drug emporium is described to be smaller than a Target but bigger than a CVS. So it was a drugstore where you could get just about anything you needed, minus the cute clothes and home decor that Target had to offer. Helen was really loved in Athens and was a very ambitious and bright young woman. She was said to be lovely, calm, and kind. She also never missed a day of work until one August morning when she wasn't at the drug emporium when she was meant to be. August 15th, 1987 was a warm and muggy day, as most are here in Georgia, but something in the air simply wasn't quite right. Ann had left her home early on that morning, around 9 a.m., according to her husband, Kenneth. She was headed to Lumpkin Street, where the estate of one of her family members was being settled. At this particular home, there was an exotic plant that Ann was fond of, and she had gone over that morning to dig up the plant and relocate it to her and Sally's garden. Ann reportedly made it to Lumpkin Street, extracted the plant, and then went to her sister's house, but she never went back home. It's important to keep in mind that while Ann and Sally lived on a family compound, this was 28 acres of land. So while they were technically neighbors, they weren't a stone's throw away from each other. In 1987, there was still some semblance of privacy between homes, unlike today where there's no space between any homes. So the day carried on and Kenneth wasn't too worried about his wife not coming home right after collecting the plant. After all, she went to her sister's house, and if you have a sister, you know that brief conversations are rare. He likely concluded she was just hanging out with Sally or running errands, or tending to her shop, but eventually, the sun went down and the stars came out, and there was still no sign of Ann. Just before 10 p.m. that evening, Kenneth officially started to really worry. There was no Life 360 or Find My iPhone that could give him some peace of mind. All Kenneth knew was that the day had come and gone, and there was no sign of his wife. So he quickly placed a phone call to 911. The officer went to the Morris home and made contact with Kenneth, who said Ann was likely at Sally's house. So the responding officer went to Sally's and noticed Sally's car was in the driveway, but Ann's was not. The strange thing was that Sally's car was on. The front left window was rolled down, and the keys were in the ignition. The responding officer found this strange, so he radioed in for a supervisor to meet him at the home. When the supervisor arrived, they began to walk around the home and were greeted with the horrific sight of Ann Orr Morris lying face down on the north side of the house. She was dressed in a red blouse and blue jeans. Why she was here is undetermined, but it's thought that she had stumbled onto a horrific scene and was taken out in order for the perpetrator to not be caught. They immediately checked Ann for a pulse. Ann was gone. She had sustained countless injuries to the head and was nearly unrecognizable. The most horrifying detail, she had been murdered with a hatchet, and this was only the outside of the home. What police would discover when entering Sally Nathanson's home would be just as heartbreaking. The police went around to the back of the home and found a sliding glass door that led into a bedroom to be completely open. The only thing blocking the entry was a curtain drawn over it, as if someone had broken in and simply walked around the curtain. In the bedroom were 2 dogs that refused to leave the room, likely because their mother, Sally Nathanson, was dead in her bed. She likely never got the chance to get up and start her day. The police continued on through the home. They walked through a hallway into a living area that had a fireplace with a wood poker in front of it. Also in the room was a coffee table, and beside the coffee table was an oddly placed pair of men's underwear. They continued on and found themselves in the kitchen of the Nathansons' home. They quickly observed that not a single light was on in the home, only the TV. It could be thought that Helen had risen early that morning to get ready for work at the drug emporium and didn't want to wake her mother, so the lights weren't turned on, and she woke up slowly to the television. On the floor of the living room, with the white noise of the news or cartoons on the TV, lay the body of 22-year-old Helen Nathanson. She was lying face down on the floor and was partly underneath a table. She had been wearing sleep shorts and a t-shirt and showed signs of extremely violent head trauma. She had also been attacked with an axe or hatchet, just like her mom and aunt. Details about this particular scene are not easy to find, but it was said to have been so disgustingly brutal that all 3 women had to be identified by their dental records because they had been hacked to bits. It was truly devastating, and the axe had been swung so hard that it had cleanly chopped off some of Helen's hair in a clean diagonal line that lined up with a slice on her back. At first, law enforcement didn't connect the dots between the Carr's Hill murders and the murder of Glenn and Rachel Sutton. Why would they? There were no similarities on the scene except one that went initially overlooked. The Carrs. Ann's car was nowhere to be found on the family's property, and it was strange that Sally's engine was running. After the murders of Ann Orr Morris and Sally and Helen Nathanson, it didn't take long for police to find their person of interest. The following morning, police were on high alert, looking for something, anything to put the minds of the Athenians at peace from the now 5 murders that had taken place. While on patrol, police did find something. Sally Nathanson's Cadillac was parked in front of a home on Moreland Avenue. It's insinuated that she owned multiple cars, explaining that the car that was in the driveway of the Carr's Hill home was a different car. Police knocked on the door of the Moreland Avenue home and were greeted by a 16-year-old Clinton Bankston Jr. He had the keys to the caddy attached to his belt at the time of opening the door. The fact that the car was in the driveway and Clinton had possession of the keys was more than enough reason for the authorities to place him under arrest for the murders of Glenn and Rachel Sutton, Ann Orr Morris, and Helen and Sally Nathanson. Also, it should be known that Clinton was a child, a teenager who hadn't learned to drive yet. It's also important to understand that Clinton had a history of suffering from learning disabilities and frequently exhibited signs of mental unrest. While most of who commit such heinous crimes often suffer from mental illness, please keep in mind that Clinton was in a severe time of need. His actions are by no means condoned, but let it be a lesson for everyone to be vigilant about spotting signs of mental illness and making sure others have the help they need.
It was early Saturday morning when police say the 16-year-old boy crept up on this house, an isolated house set in the woods. Police say once there he murdered Ann Morris outside the home, then went inside and hacked Miss Morris's sister Sally Nathanson and her daughter Helen Nathanson to death. Police believe robbery was the motive.
Clinton initially claimed that his friend named Chris Ward was actually the young man who committed the crimes. Clinton admitted to being both at the Sutton home and Carr's Hill, but said he was simply there and that Chris had committed the crimes. Police took this into strong consideration and searched high and low for a man in Athens and surrounding areas named Chris Ward, but there wasn't anyone. Later on, Clinton's mother even admitted that she sometimes suspected that Chris didn't exist, and he likely didn't. It's speculated that Clinton crafted or imagined Chris as a scapegoat for his own actions, or he would use Chris to explain to his mom where he was or how he had obtained things. Psychologists speculate that Clinton may have truly believed that Chris was real and that he perhaps suffered from DID, dissociative identity disorder, a mental disorder in which a person has 2 or more distinct personalities or identities that influence or control their behavior. It's also speculated that he could have been suffering from or developing a form of schizophrenia in which he believed Chris was really there, and he wasn't committing any crimes. None of this changes that 5 people had lost their lives, and the Athens authorities knew that, so Clinton was officially arrested for the murder of 5. However, there was more reason that led them to this arrest. Clinton had been extremely inconsistent with his accounts of events through interviews, and the Red and Black, an Athens newspaper, published an article in May of 1988 that stated, "When officers pulled out a diagram of the house," referring to the Sutton home, "and pointed to the wrong room, Clinton Bankston corrected them." Not only did this prove Clinton had been at the Sutton home, but it also showed that he had spent enough time there to understand the different rooms on their floor plan. During his trial, Clinton pled guilty by reason of insanity, but his sentence is what stumped a lot of officials. Many thought Clinton deserved the death penalty for what he had done, and at this time that would mean strapping a 16-year-old boy into the electric chair. Anyone with a semblance of a heart saw how brutal this would be to do to a juvenile, especially one who had already been suffering inside his own mind. Luckily for Clinton, on May 12, 1988, his 17th birthday, he would be sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences in prison. However, it's a little unclear if this was because people didn't wish to see a child put to death, or if it was because a bill passed right before his sentencing that determined anyone under the age of 16 at the time of the crime could not be sentenced to death. Why Clinton committed these crimes is still a mystery, but some notes of his were recovered from his home during his arrest that strongly suggested he may have been trying to get rich. It makes sense. He attacked 2 very wealthy and prominent Athens families and was not as fortunate himself. However, it's either unreported or unknown if Clinton ever actually took anything of value from the homes. In the notes, he outlines all the people he would take care of with his money and wanted to make sure that everyone would have a bed to sleep in. In 2019, Clinton filed a motion seeking to vacate his guilty plea and sentencing, which was ultimately denied. The Georgia High Court held fast to the thought that Clinton was tried fairly in 1987. Today, in July of 2025, Clinton is now 54 years old, serving out the rest of his sentence at Dooley State Prison in Unadilla, Georgia. The summer of 1987 rattled Athens to its core. What was once seen as a safe, tight-knit community was shaken by a series of murders that felt senseless and surreal. The Suttons, the Nathansons, and Ann Orr Morris were people who built their lives filled with purpose, art, education, and family. Their loss wasn't just a tragedy, it was a fracture in the identity of a city that prided itself on safety, creativity, and closeness. And at the center of it all was a boy, just 16, whose mind may have never fully understood the damage he had done. Clinton Bankston's crimes left a permanent mark not only on his victims' families, but on Athens itself. We may never know the full truth, but what we can do is remember the lives lost, not as headlines or case numbers, but as people, as women who created, taught, and nurtured, as a couple who gave their lives to knowledge and community. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.